Hey there. Tonight, we're stepping quietly into the shadowed world of medieval justice, a realm where punishment went far beyond simply ending a life. In those times, justice was as much about fear and control as it was about law. The methods were often cruel, calculated to prolong suffering and to humiliate the condemned long after death. Whether it was the slow agony of the breaking wheel, the fiery blaze of public execution, or the cold finality of hanging, these punishments were designed to make a warning etched into the memories of all who watched. It was a world where pain was public, mercy was rare, and cruelty was woven deeply into the very fabric of law. So, before you get cozy under that warm blanket, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if what I do here genuinely helps you wind down at night. And hey, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? There's something oddly soothing about knowing there are others awake with us, wandering through history together. Now, dim the lights. Light a candle if you've got one, or simply let the soft glow of your screen draw you in. Close your eyes slowly and let the noise of today fade away. You're stepping into a world of flickering torchlight and whispered fears, where justice is harsh and public. Punishment is a slow shadow that lingers long after the deed is done, and mercy is a distant, fading hope. In the stillness of the night, as flickering candlelight throws long shadows across your walls, imagine a world where execution was not just a punishment, but a performance. A world where pain was paraded before crowds, where cruelty was measured in minutes and screams, and where ingenuity turned death into spectacle. Among the darkest of these instruments, none has haunted the imagination quite like the brazen bull. This is no ordinary punishment. The brazen bull was a grotesque marvel, crafted not just to kill, but to amplify suffering, to echo agony, and to leave a legend behind. Though its origins are older than the medieval world, the tale of the bull echoed through centuries, whispered in cloisters and taverns alike. It wasn't just the death itself, but how the death was delivered. Slow, theatrical, and echoing with the sound of human suffering, transformed into something eerily like music. The story begins not in a medieval courtyard, but in ancient Greece, in the city of Akragas in Sicily. There, a tyrant named Phalaris reigned, his name alone enough to bring a shudder. It was for him, the legend says, that the brazen bull was first forged. A solid brass sculpture in the shape of a bull, gleaming and hollow, large enough to hold a man within its belly. But this was no mere statue. It was a device of death. A door was fitted in the side, hidden in the curves of the beast's flank. Once opened, a man could be forced inside, the hatch shut, and the air sealed. Beneath the belly, a fire would be lit. Slowly, deliberately, the brass would grow hot, first warming, then blistering, then burning. The victim would scream, thrash, cry out for mercy. And here is where the true horror begins. The bull's design channeled those screams through a network of tubes and chambers, distorting them. When they emerged from the bull's mouth, they no longer sounded like cries of pain. They echoed out into the air as the bellow of a beast, a terrible, mechanical groan. The audience didn't just watch suffering, they listened to it, dressed in the haunting song of the bull. Though the brazen bull was a creature of antiquity, Its shadow loomed long. In the Middle Ages, the horror of it was retold often. Monks scribbled warnings about it in margins of illuminated texts. Executioners shared the story with quiet awe. It became a symbol not just of cruelty, but of what happened when art and punishment collided. In an era when pain was used to teach, to control, to save souls and punish bodies, the brazen bull became a kind of dark parable. By the 13th and 14th centuries, it wasn't unheard of for rulers to borrow the idea, not in the full golden form, perhaps, but in spirit. Metal devices of confinement, heated with flame, reappeared in torture chambers from Italy to the Holy Roman Empire. Though no medieval bull remains to us, records suggest the concept lived on in other infernal contraptions. Iron maidens, heated chairs, copper coffins. The goal was always the same: to make death last longer than life had any right to. But what kind of world allows such a thing to exist? To thrive? In medieval Europe, punishment was meant to be public. Executions were theater, a way to scare, to control, to show the consequences of sin and disobedience. There were no quiet prison cells for serious crimes. There were gallows in the market square. There were execution platforms outside cathedral walls. There were fires lit beneath sinners, and there were crowds, eager, curious, sometimes even cheering. For them, the brazen bull wasn't an ancient myth. It was a possibility, a reminder of how far cruelty could go. Imagine, for a moment, what it would be like, not to be the ruler who orders it, not the crowd who watches, but the person inside. The metal feels cold when you're first pushed in, its polished surface reflecting torchlight like water. There's barely enough room to stand, your back pressed against the curved walls, your limbs forced into a crouch. Then the door slams shut. The world goes dark. Air, thick and metallic, settles in your lungs. You wait. Then comes the hiss and crackle of kindling below, the scent of smoke, the warmth rising, slowly at first, then faster, until the metal begins to burn your skin, until your breath comes short and your screams rise up. Not as words, but as distorted groans funneled through the tubes above your head. Outside, they hear the bull sing. Inside, you burn alive. Was it real? That question has haunted historians. The earliest mention of the brazen bull comes from Greek writers centuries before the Middle Ages, and some believe the tale is too theatrical to be true. Yet the idea was passed down for generations, not just as a myth, but as a symbol of how barbaric justice could become when power went unchecked. And in a time when real executions involved dismemberment, impalement, and public boiling, the brazen bull wasn't unimaginable. It was merely the logical conclusion of a world that viewed pain as both punishment and performance. Even in medieval sermons, the bull made appearances. Preachers would speak of it as a warning of what happened to those who turned from the church, who committed heresy, who dared to defy the divine order. Just as the bull punished flesh, so too would hell punish the soul. The image was unforgettable. The gold gleam, the burning core, the sound of sin bellowing out through bronze. And so the brazen bull lingers, not in museum halls, but in the collective memory of cruelty. A reminder that, for much of human history, imagination was not used only to build beauty, but to refine brutality. And in that long night of medieval justice, where pain and piety met, the echo of the bull's scream was never too far away. And then, there it stands, silhouetted against the sky, weathered, creaking, and grotesquely familiar. The gallows tree. It wasn't always a tree, of course. Sometimes it was a wooden scaffold built hastily near the village square. Other times it was a permanent structure outside city walls, tall enough to be seen from the road. But the name stuck, because something about the word tree, with its branches, its rope, and its silence, fit too well. The gallows was not just a tool for death. It was a symbol, and it hung over the medieval world like a shadow with no sunset. Hanging was not the quickest way to die, not the cleanest, nor even the bloodiest, but it was the most public, the most ordinary. Executions by hanging were a regular feature of medieval justice, used for theft, treason, rebellion, and even minor offenses if the mood of the court demanded. If you were poor, powerless, or simply unlucky, a noose could find its way around your neck. It began with the sentence, usually handed down in a language thick with formality: to be hanged by the neck until dead. There was no doubt about what came next. The condemned would be led, sometimes dragged to the gallows. Along the way, they might be jeered, pitied, or even offered last-minute confessions. The walk itself was part of the punishment. It was long, slow, and the scaffold always waited like a grim, open mouth. There were many ways to hang a man, or a woman. The oldest was simple suspension, a rope tied around the neck, slung over a beam, and the victim lifted or dropped just enough to dangle. This method didn't kill quickly. There was no neck-breaking snap, just strangulation, slow, torturous, often lasting minutes or longer. The body would writhe, legs kicked, tongue swelled. The hands might claw uselessly at the rope or tremble as they went numb. And all the while, the crowd watched. Then came the drop method. In the 13th and 14th centuries, executioners began using a trapdoor or cart to create a sudden fall. The idea was to break the neck instantly, a cleaner death. But it didn't always work. Too short a drop and the victim would still strangle. Too long and the head could pop clean off. There was a grim science to it, one that few bothered to perfect. After all, death was the goal, not comfort. Some hangings were staged with theater in mind. A scaffold was built at dawn, and villagers gathered with bread in hand to watch. It was a social affair. The children came too, some perched on their fathers' shoulders. Priests gave last rites. The executioner adjusted the noose, always with a ritualistic precision, tight just beneath the left ear, tied in the hangman's knot, a thick and unforgiving twist. If the condemned was lucky or high-born, they might be blindfolded. If not, they saw everything: the sun, the crowd, the trapdoor at their feet, and when the lever was pulled, the sound was sudden and absolute. A thud, then a jolt, then silence. The body might twitch, the rope might sway, but for the most part, death came with eerie stillness. Not all hangings were meant to end with death. Some were staged as short drops or partial hangings, meant to torture, not kill. In these, the victim's toes brushed the ground. They could struggle, stretch, try to find breath, but only prolong the inevitable. These were punishments of spectacle and symbolism. They said, "We control your breath, your body, your end." In certain regions, there were gibbet trees, not just gallows, but cages. If a hanging had taken place and the crime was particularly notorious, the corpse might be left on display, swinging in the breeze, its body slowly decaying, or worse, locked in a metal cage called a gibbet, hung high where crows could gather and travelers could gawk. It was a warning. Here is what happens to traitors, to thieves, to those who defy the order of things. Gallows didn't discriminate by gender. Women were hanged too, often for infanticide, adultery, or petty theft. Their bodies were rarely left on display, but their deaths were just as public. Sometimes entire executions were held back to back. Multiple nooses, multiple trapdoors, and multiple victims dropped at once. And in the cold, quiet moments afterward, the scaffold groaned beneath the weight of justice done. Of course, executions could be botched. Ropes broke, knots slipped, bodies fell awkwardly. In rare cases, the condemned survived the first attempt. What happened next depended on the mood of the crowd or the mercy of the law. Some were hanged again. Others were pardoned, considered saved by God. But most were not so lucky. For the executioner, this was just another task, a job, often paid by the head, with bonuses for speed or spectacle. They knew how to measure the weight of a man against the length of the drop. They understood how long a body twitched before going still. And they wore hoods, not just for anonymity, but for dignity. They were both feared and necessary. The hand of law given form. In the towns where the gallows stood permanently, birds would nest in the beams. Ropes would be reused, though eventually they frayed. Children dared each other to touch the scaffold. Drunks staggered past it at night. And everyone knew someone who had once stood there, or feared they might someday. It was ordinary. That's what made it terrifying. The gallows didn't need fire or blades. It needed only gravity, rope, and silence. And it worked. Not because it was swift, but because it was sure. Even now, when the world is quieter and the old wooden structures are long gone, the gallows tree remains in our language. In old stories, in nursery rhymes, in ghost tales whispered on dark nights. The idea of the noose, the drop, the moment where breath ends, it lingers. The next day, the morning was still and gray, the kind of silence that settles just before something unthinkable. Across the square, wet cobblestones gleamed under the weight of early dew, and wooden beams creaked as they were hauled into place. Bit by bit, a scaffold took shape, not for a gallows, but for something slower. A platform surrounded by bundles of dry straw and chopped kindling, stacked waist-high. Today would not end quickly. This was no execution of haste, but one of theater. Someone would burn. In medieval Europe, fire was more than flame. It was a divine instrument. Church and crown alike believed it had the power not only to punish the body, but to purify the soul. To burn someone alive was not merely to end their life. It was, in their eyes, to give their spirit one last chance at redemption. If you screamed loud enough, repented fast enough, wept honestly enough, perhaps your agony would buy you mercy on the other side. That was the hope. But mercy, more often than not, never came. The accused varied. Heretics, witches, scholars, peasants, women and men who'd said the wrong thing, believed the wrong doctrine, healed with herbs, or dared to question authority. You didn't have to summon demons. You didn't need to hex cattle. Sometimes it was enough to own a forbidden book, or to say bread was just bread and not the body of Christ. That could be all it took to be declared unholy. And for that, the pyre awaited. Picture the scene. You are led to the square in rags. Your hands are bound, but not behind your back. In front, so you might clasp them in prayer. The crowd has already gathered. Children are on shoulders. Mothers cover mouths with kerchiefs. There are whispers, gasps, laughter even. This is a spectacle, after all. Public burnings drew people like festivals. Bread sellers and peddlers lined the square. Church bells rang to mark the hour. You would die, but not alone. Hundreds would watch you go. The executioner waits by the stake. He is not masked, not ashamed. His tunic is worn, his hands calloused. He has done this before. The priest is there too. He offers you a last chance to confess, to renounce your errors, to beg forgiveness. Some took it. Others stayed silent. Some shouted to the crowd that they were innocent, that God would judge differently, that fire could burn only flesh, not truth. You are fastened to the stake, sometimes with ropes, sometimes chains. If you are fortunate, a pouch of gunpowder might be tied around your neck, an act of mercy from someone sympathetic. It might explode when the fire reached it, snapping your neck and sparing you the worst of it. But most weren't that lucky. Then, the torch. It touches the base of the pyre, dry kindling first, crackling like leaves. The smoke starts low, white and lazy. Then the fire climbs. The wood hisses and pops. The first licks of flame touch your feet. You twist instinctively, but there's nowhere to go. As the fire rises, so does your voice. Screams, curses, sobs, until they're choked out by smoke. Your skin blisters, hair curls and blackens. Your legs, now charred, give out. But the ropes hold you upright. You continue to burn. The crowd watches in a strange hush, equal parts horror and reverence. For them, this is not mere execution. It is warning. It is ceremony. It is moral theater. They have been told you were wicked, that your beliefs endangered the souls of others, that if heresy spreads, the entire social order could unravel. Better one body in flame than 100 in doubt. Fear was a powerful teacher, and fire, the loudest lesson. Burning wasn't reserved for witches alone. That image, the woman in black robes casting curses, is mostly a product of later folklore. In truth, many of the earliest burnings were of religious dissenters. The Cathars in France, the Lollards in England, the Hussites in Bohemia. Whole movements branded as dangerous because they challenged doctrine. The church viewed heresy like a cancer. If it wasn't cauterized, it would spread. Fire became the cure. And then, of course, came the witch trials. By the late Middle Ages and into the early modern period, fear of sorcery began to rise. Poor harvests, stillbirths, sudden storms, all could be blamed on someone nearby, usually a woman, often older, widowed, or poor. If your neighbor's cow died and you once quarreled with her, you might accuse her of hexing it. If a child fell ill and you had no explanation, someone might point to the herbalist in the village. Trials followed, but they were rarely fair. Proof was subjective. Torture often coerced confessions, and fire awaited at the end. It is a myth that all accused witches were burned. Many were hanged, drowned, or imprisoned. But in continental Europe, particularly in Germany, Switzerland, and parts of France, burning was a favored method. The Inquisition, both Spanish and Roman, made generous use of flame. It was thought appropriate. Witches consorted with the devil, and so deserved a devil's end. Yet there was something disturbingly human about the process. Executioners had techniques to prolong suffering or shorten it, depending on the order. Fires could be built to burn fast with dry pine and straw, or slow, damp wood, green logs that smoked more than they burned. A slow fire didn't consume you quickly. It cooked you. You didn't die in a flash of light. You died over minutes, then hours, as heat stripped you of breath. And yet, it wasn't always legal. Some kings and judges began to question the practice. Over time, laws changed. By the 18th century, public burnings were largely abandoned in most of Europe, but their shadow remained. Their memory lingered in stained glass windows and whispered folk tales, in trial records and priestly sermons, in nightmares and cautionary tales. To be burned alive was to be made an example, but it also meant something deeper, that your beliefs, your thoughts were so dangerous, so threatening, that they had to be erased by fire. You weren't just punished for what you did, but for what you represented. That made burning not only cruel, but chillingly symbolic. Then, something waits in the center of the square, a wooden wheel taller than a man, stained by sun and storm, and by something darker, a rough-hewn structure from a carpenter's hands, but now a tool not for building, but for breaking. The townsfolk gather. Children stand on tiptoe. The priest watches with a quiet expression, clutching his beads, and beside the wheel, the executioner waits. Breaking on the wheel wasn't a punishment meant for mercy. It was not a swift death, nor a hidden one. This was suffering as ritual, as message, as brutal theater, reserved for the worst crimes or the most defiant offenders. It was never carried out in haste. Every step was deliberate. Every bone broken was broken in full view of God and neighbor. The condemned man is dragged forward, often already beaten, sometimes half-conscious. He is stripped, tied, limbs bound not for restraint, but for exposure. The wheel is laid flat before him, horizontal like a great wooden table. His arms and legs are spread wide across it, each limb pulled across the gaps between the spokes, leaving them unsupported, vulnerable, hanging just slightly above the hard earth. Then the execution begins, not with a sword, not with fire, but with an iron bar, heavy, simple, and devastating. The executioner raises it high, then brings it down, once, twice, again and again, onto the exposed limbs of the condemned. First, the arms, then the legs. The bar crashes down across the bones, shattering them, splintering them, forcing them to bend in ways they were never meant to. Each blow is meant to break, not just once, but in several places, between the joints, midway through the long bones. Clean breaks are rare. More often, they shatter. The body begins to twist, unnatural angles, flesh swelling, bruising. The screams come quickly at first, raw, instinctive, but eventually turn to whimpers, to gasps, sometimes to silence. Once the limbs are broken, they are woven through the spokes of the wheel, not metaphorically, but literally. The arms and legs, now limp and pliable, are threaded between the wooden gaps, looped and twisted in a grotesque display. The body becomes part of the wheel, a thing to be hoisted, displayed. Now the wheel is lifted upright, sometimes nailed to a tall post, sometimes simply balanced at an angle. The broken man is left there, twisted and mangled, his face often uncovered so that all may see. Sometimes he's alive. Often, he is not yet dead. That was the point. The suffering was not only meant to punish the guilty, but to remind the living. Crows circle. The flies arrive first, then the rot. In summer heat, the smell rises quickly. In colder months, the body stiffens into a gruesome sculpture. But always, always, the wheel remains visible. It becomes a landmark of punishment, a warning, a sermon in wood and bone. Not all wheel executions were alike. Some regions of Europe, especially the Holy Roman Empire, refined the practice to a cruel precision. They had names for each bone to be broken, set orders for the blows. Some criminals were granted what was called the coup de grace, a final blow to the chest or to the neck to end their suffering more swiftly. Others were denied it. Their punishment was to linger, to endure. In France, the wheel became known as the roue. In Germany, das Rad. It was not reserved only for murderers or traitors. Highwaymen, grave robbers, counterfeiters, even rebellious peasants might find themselves beneath it. It was not a punishment dealt out in secret. It was written into law codes, debated in courts, discussed in churches. This was justice, as defined by those in power. There were variations, of course. In some cases, the wheel was used vertically, with the body lashed to its rim and spun while blows were delivered. In others, the condemned was placed on a small platform beneath the wheel, and the device itself was dropped onto them, using its weight to crush ribs and organs. The methods changed, but the goal remained the same: a death that was slow, visible, and unforgettable. The executioner was both feared and familiar. Not merely a butcher, but a performer of sorts. Some wielded the iron bar with grim professionalism. Others took pride in their technique, measuring each blow, watching the crowd for their reactions. A well-executed wheel breaking might draw applause. A poor one, derision. The condemned man's suffering was part of the act, but so too was the executioner's performance. Imagine now the silence of night in a town where the wheel has been raised. Long after the crowd has gone home, after the market stalls have been packed away, after the torches have burned low. The body still hangs, broken and swaying slightly in the wind, the creak of the wood, the occasional rustle of wings, a presence that cannot be ignored. Mothers glance toward it with unease. Children avoid it with wide eyes. Yet no one removes it. Not for days. Not until the message has been well and truly received. In some places, the wheel became more than just a method. It became a symbol of divine justice. A wheel might be carved into a village gate or engraved above a court. It represented the turning of fate, the crushing of sin. But to the common folk, it meant only one thing: agony. Not all who faced the wheel died on it. Some were left to perish slowly, over hours or even days. A few, by some miracle or sheer force of will, survived the initial blows. One German man, sentenced in the 16th century, lived for 3 full days after his breaking. 3 days exposed to the sun, to thirst, to birds. 3 days of slow decay. Some say the townspeople begged for mercy on his behalf. Others say they simply watched. The wheel faded from use by the 18th century as Enlightenment ideas took root and public executions began to lose their grip on the European conscience. But its memory lingered in folk tales, in old court records, in the rusted fragments found buried near old gallows hills. It was never the most common punishment, but it was one of the most feared, and once seen, never forgotten. Now, this another sentence begins not in death, but in degradation. If you were to be drawn and quartered, you would already have been labeled the worst kind of criminal in the eyes of the crown. A traitor. Not just a thief or a killer, but someone who dared to rise against the king, who conspired to upend the order God had allegedly ordained. In medieval England, that meant your punishment would not just be severe, it would be made into a message. First, the drawing. Contrary to popular belief, this didn't always refer to being drawn, as in disemboweled. That came later. No, you were drawn to the place of execution, dragged through the mud and refuse of the city streets, tied face up to a rough wooden hurdle or sled, your arms bound, legs splayed, every jolt of the horse pulling you, scraping your skin raw. You weren't afforded dignity. That was the point. The people needed to see your face, twisted, pale, already streaked with blood from an early lash or two. This was public theater. The crowd lined the roads for miles, jeering, spitting, throwing things. Children laughed. Vendors sold meat pies. And still the horses dragged you forward, toward the scaffold. Once you arrived, the true work began. You were cut down from the hurdle and paraded, still alive, to the gallows. There you would be hanged, but not to die. The executioner was careful. Rope was tied, not to break the neck, but to strangle slowly, just until you lost consciousness, just until your legs twitched and your skin turned pale. Then they cut you down, sometimes too early, just to prolong the agony. Gasping, wheezing, retching on the wooden boards. You were not yet granted release. That would come next. Then came the disembowelment. You were tied down, arms and legs secured to the scaffold so you couldn't writhe away. The executioner, usually practiced and unemotional, opened your abdomen with a long knife. Not with one clean cut, but with slow, practiced incisions, designed to hurt, not kill. Your stomach would be slit open, your intestines exposed and pulled from your body, sometimes still warm and twitching with the last flickers of life. These organs were thrown into a cauldron of boiling water or burned on a brazier right before your eyes. The crowd watched, some turning away, others cheering. The point was to reduce you, not just physically, but spiritually. Often during this stage, your genitals were cut off, severed as a final humiliation and flung into the fire. The symbolism was clear. Your legacy ends here. No children, no name passed on. You die without dignity, without lineage, without mercy. If you hadn't already died of shock, blood loss, or pain, the next part sealed it. The beheading. But again, it wasn't always clean. The axe or sword might take several strikes, especially if dull, or if the executioner was incompetent or sadistic. A botched beheading could mean more agony, more gasps, more horror for the watching public. And then came the quartering. Your lifeless body was hacked into 4 parts, arms and legs removed from your torso. Sometimes this was done with axe or sword, but occasionally with horses, each limb tied to a separate steed. If this method was used while you were still alive, a rare cruelty, it meant being torn apart, literally pulled in 4 directions until the body gave way with a wet, snapping crack. Each quarter of you, arm, leg, head, torso, was then salted and boiled, not to honor the dead, but to preserve it for display. The king's justice did not end at death. Your body parts were sent across the kingdom, nailed to city gates, mounted on poles along roads, or displayed at bridges and towers. Your head, tarred to keep it from decaying too quickly, was usually placed on a spike at London Bridge, staring down at passers-by with glassy, unseeing eyes. The message was simple. This is what happens to traitors. Some of the most famous figures in English history met this fate. William Wallace, the Scottish rebel whose name would live on through myth and film, was drawn and quartered in 1305. After his execution, his head was stuck atop London Bridge, and his limbs were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, each city a symbol of English control over Scottish resistance. Others, like Guy Fawkes and his co-conspirators in the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, suffered similar ends. Fawkes, in a small act of defiance, jumped from the gallows and broke his neck before the full horror could begin. But his body was still quartered. His name still whispered in fear. To be drawn and quartered wasn't just about death. It was about obliteration, of identity, of body, of name. You didn't just die. You disappeared in pieces. You were scattered, erased, remembered only as a warning. And the people watched. That may be the cruelest part. This wasn't done in secret. It was a spectacle, meant to bind loyalty to the crown through fear. Families were forced to witness the punishment. Children too young to understand watched entrails steam in the winter air. Priests stood by to bless a soul whose body was being destroyed by the very laws of men. Pain wasn't a side effect. It was the tool. The scaffold was swept clean at the end of the day. The blood ran down gutters, mixed with rain and filth. Life returned to normal. And another name was written into the roll of traitors who had been drawn and quartered. Nothing more than meat in the gears of justice. In a cold stone chamber, the air is heavy, not just with dampness, but with the unspoken weight of dread. There is no fire here, no torch flickering in welcome, only the echo of slow footsteps, the scrape of iron against flagstone, and the sound of a man breathing in fear. Tonight, we step into the world of one of the most chilling execution methods from medieval history. Peine forte et dure, the slow and deliberate crushing of a person under stones until they either spoke or died. The phrase itself is French, strong and hard punishment, but the method made its notorious home in English law courts during the late Middle Ages. It was not used for every crime. This punishment was reserved for those who refused to speak in court. Specifically, it targeted individuals who would not enter a plea, neither guilty nor not guilty. Silence, in a system that relied on confessions or formal pleas, was not an option the courts could tolerate. And so, they forced speech through weight. Literally, the condemned was brought forward and laid flat upon the bare floor. Arms and legs were splayed outward in a posture both vulnerable and humiliating. A board was placed atop the body, usually a rough plank, heavy and impersonal. And then, slowly, methodically, stones were added, one at a time. Each stone a question, each stone a demand, each stone asking, "Will you speak now?" The process was brutal, but not chaotic. There was a measured cruelty to it. The goal was not to kill swiftly. In fact, that was seen as a failure. The ideal result was a plea. The man beneath the growing pile was meant to crack under pressure, not just physically, but mentally. Most did. Eventually, the weight became unbearable. Ribs shifted, muscles tore, and the lungs began to scream silently for room to expand. The human body, not made to be flattened like dough, began to betray its owner. And then, finally, the words might come. guilty. Or not guilty. Either one would do. The court just wanted the machine to function again. But not all chose speech. Some remained silent, whether out of fear of losing their land, since property was forfeited upon a guilty plea, or from sheer defiance, or faith, or madness. Some resisted until the end. These were the ones crushed not into confession, but into the silence of death. Perhaps the most famous case was that of Giles Corey, though he lived centuries later during the Salem witch trials of 1692 in colonial America. Accused of witchcraft and refusing to enter a plea, Corey was pressed for days. Witnesses say he uttered only 2 words as the sheriff demanded his answer. More weight. His legend has grown, but the truth remains. He was pressed to death, crushed slowly under stones, his ribs shattered, his tongue forced from his mouth, until finally, mercifully, he died. It was an old method by then, but it had not lost its power. In medieval Europe, pressing was not used as frequently as hanging, beheading, or burning, but its psychological terror was unmatched. To be crushed was to die slowly, without blood, without fire, without spectacle. There was no crowd cheering, no trumpet blaring your doom. Only the creak of timber, the clink of stone, and the sound of your own ribs giving way. It was execution as a conversation, one in which only one side could speak, and the other was punished for staying silent. Executioners sometimes offered mercy in strange forms. A particularly heavy stone placed early, a foot pressed down discreetly, a whispered, "Speak now." But mercy had little place in the law. This was justice. After all, order must be restored. What made pressing so particularly cruel was its dual purpose. It was not meant solely to kill, but to extract. It was not just execution, it was coercion, and that meant prolonging the agony until either voice or life broke. Think of the lungs. They expand when you breathe, but as the weight increases, that expansion becomes harder and harder. Breathing turns into panting, then gasping, then nothing. Slowly, the lungs are compressed into uselessness. Death doesn't come from trauma. It comes from suffocation. And all the while, the body screams in pain from splintered bones and shredded skin. It wasn't always performed in a dungeon. Sometimes it happened outside the jail, in public view. Not as a show for entertainment, but as a grim warning. Citizens would walk past the man under the stones. Some would whisper prayers. Others would look away. A few might watch in silence, eyes wide, reminded that in this world, silence was not golden. It was fatal. There were those who argued against the practice, even then. Clergy, philosophers, and the occasional brave lawyer. But for most of the medieval period, justice was not about individual rights. It was about the smooth operation of the legal system. Silence jammed the gears, and the law had a way of removing blockages. And so it continued, in musty courtrooms, in the shadowed corners of stone prisons, in alleys behind jails, always the same ritual, the laying down, the board, the stones, the silence, the crushing. It was a death that came not with a scream, but with a whisper, or no sound at all. A death that asked, again and again, "Will you speak now?" Suddenly, you're walking down a muddy road that curves just beyond the village. The wind stinks of smoke and wet straw. Up ahead, you notice something swaying from a tall wooden post. It creaks gently, as if moved by breath alone. As you get closer, you see it. A twisted iron shape. A cage. Inside it, what's left of a man, or what used to be one. This is not a hanging, not a clean beheading. This is something else. This is gibbeting, a punishment reserved for the most despised, most feared, or most symbolic criminals. It wasn't always about killing someone. Often, they were already dead. But the cage made sure they stayed visible. The iron cage was not for justice. It was for reminder. Let's begin with what it looked like. A gibbet cage was typically custom built for each victim. Blacksmiths would hammer iron bars into a frame that vaguely mirrored the human body. Some were narrow and tight, forcing limbs into grotesque angles. Others allowed the corpse to swing and slump unnaturally with every gust of wind. The cage might have shoulder rings, chest plates, shackles, and a long spine of metal running down the back. A metal crown might be fixed to the head, all of it designed not for comfort. There was none, but for longevity. You didn't want the body to fall apart too soon. Gibbeting came in two forms. The first was post-mortem. The criminal was executed by hanging or beheading, and their corpse was immediately placed into the iron frame. This was more common. The second was far worse, gibbeting alive. In this case, a man was forced into the cage while still breathing, then hoisted up into the air and left to die slowly, exposed to sun, rain, birds, flies, hunger, thirst, and madness. This wasn't just a medieval practice. Gibbeting appeared all across Europe for centuries, from the 13th well into the 18th century. But in the medieval world, where death was always close and fear was a political tool, it had a particularly ghastly presence. Towns would set up gibbets on roadsides, near gallows, or just outside city gates. Sometimes the bodies were chained in groups, sometimes in lonely silence. But the purpose was always the same: to be seen. You couldn't look away. And that was the point. In England, gibbeting was frequently used after a public hanging. Murderers, robbers, and especially highwaymen, men who preyed on travelers, were gibbeted near the scenes of their crimes. There, they would rot, twist in the wind, and drip onto the road below. Travelers would pass beneath the cage like a grim warning post. This, the state said, is what happens to those who stray. In France, they called it pendaison en effigie when done symbolically. But when the body was real, it was simply le gibet. Corpses hung in cages over rivers, over castle walls, at crossroads. The idea was to defile the body beyond death, to deny it rest, and to show the world that even in death, the guilty belonged to the law. The slow decay of a body in a cage was no small thing. The elements would take their time. Skin would blacken, swell, and split. Birds would perch on the iron bars and peck at soft spots. Rain would pool in the skull. Bugs would nest in the eye sockets. In winter, the corpse would freeze stiff. In summer, it would stink and drip. The smell. Imagine that for a moment. Every time the wind shifted toward the village, you'd catch a reminder. A sour, greasy scent. A warning on the breeze. And then there were the living gibbets. Rare, but real. Men locked alive inside those cages, sometimes with iron collars to keep their necks upright, sometimes hanging by their arms and chest. Death might take hours, or days. Some gibbet cages allowed no movement at all. Others allowed too much. Joints grinding as the man struggled to breathe, limbs swelling with blood and insect bites. Sometimes, torches were lit below to speed things up. Sometimes, they were not. The crowd would gather and wait, not just for the death, but for the transformation. A man into a lesson, a human into a rotting landmark. There are records of men begging to be killed first. Some executioners, in moments of pity, struck a final blow before sealing the cage. Others did not, and there was no burial afterward, not right away. In some cases, the corpse remained hanging for years. There's a record from 1742 of a murderer whose skeleton stayed in a cage for over 30 years. Bones picked clean, iron rusted red with rain. Travelers gave the site a wide berth. Locals named the hill after the body. Maps were drawn with the gibbet as a reference point. That man's death outlasted his life by decades. In Germany, they had similar practices, called the Halseisen, iron collar, or the Käfig, cage. In Italy, Spain, and Eastern Europe, variations appeared. Suspended cages, iron baskets, and even chains from castle towers where the body would be pecked by ravens in full view of the courtyard. But it wasn't just about punishment. Gibbeting was psychological warfare. Imagine being a child growing up with that cage visible from your window. You'd pass it every day on your way to church. Your parents might point to it and say, "Obey, or end up like him." It was a constant, swinging reminder that the state had long arms and longer memory. And for the family of the victim, there was no grave to weep over, no ceremony. Their loved one was reduced to a nameless warning post. Some tried to steal the body back, risking arrest just to bury their dead. Others were forbidden even that. Eventually, gibbeting fell out of favor. By the 19th century, most countries abandoned it. The Enlightenment brought with it new ideas, less public cruelty, more behind closed doors justice. The cages were taken down, the bones buried, the iron rusted and forgotten. But every so often, one is found, dug up during construction, uncovered in old city records, or hidden in cathedral cellars, a twisted frame of blackened metal, shaped like a man, a reminder of the time when justice didn't end with death, but lingered, swinging in the wind, in full view of everyone who dared walk by. Another moment arrives with a hush that settles over the gathered crowd like a thick fog. The condemned is led from the dank, shadowed cell or prison yard, shackled but upright. There's a strange tension in the air. Everyone present knows what is coming, yet none speak the word aloud. Beheading, the punishment of choice for nobles, a mercy in a world full of tortures far crueler. But as swift as it might be, the Axeman's mercy is anything but guaranteed. The condemned stands before the chopping block, a wooden platform scarred from countless past executions. The blade that will decide their fate gleams cold and sharp, resting in the hands of the executioner, known as the Axeman, a figure both feared and strangely respected. His role is brutal, but vital. For even in a world ruled by violence, there was an unspoken hope that death might come swiftly, that dignity might be preserved in the final moments. Yet, history tells a darker tale. The executioner approaches. His face is usually hidden beneath a coarse hood, his hands steady despite the terrible weight of his task. Sometimes, he is a professional who has trained his whole life to wield the axe with deadly precision. Other times, he is a reluctant village man pressed into service, trembling under the weight of the blade, unsteady and unsure. The condemned is laid prone, their neck extended over the block, an ancient, unforgiving altar. They might have seconds to say a prayer, to clutch a crucifix or a rosary, to whisper forgiveness or curses. Their heart pounds, loud in their ears, drowning out the gasps and murmurs of the crowd. This moment hangs suspended, stretched thin between life and death. Then, the axeman raises his weapon high, muscles tensing under weathered skin. The blade falls, a thunderclap in the still air, a flash of steel that promises finality. But not all executions end with a single stroke. There are tales of botched beheadings, where the blade caught flesh, but failed to sever bone, leaving the condemned writhing in agony. Sometimes the executioner's aim was off, one stroke slicing the neck, but not cleanly, through the spinal cord, causing a terrible, slow death. Other times, the axe was dull, or the executioner inexperienced, requiring multiple blows. The crowd, once hushed, might begin to murmur nervously or even scream in horror as the victim's fate stretched agonizingly longer than anyone wished. Such scenes were nightmares made real. Men and women pleading for mercy even as their heads remained stubbornly attached, their bodies convulsing, their faces frozen in terror and pain. Blood sprayed, staining the block and soaking into the dirt below. Sometimes the condemned would try to lift their severed head, trying to speak, even in death, a ghastly sight that seared itself into the memories of all who witnessed. Even when the axeman was skilled, there was no absolute guarantee of mercy. Death was death, but dignity was fragile, easily shattered by the smallest mistake. Despite this, beheading was considered a privilege, at least for the noble class. It was swift compared to other medieval methods like hanging, drawing, and quartering, or burning at the stake, which dragged out pain for hours or even days. To be beheaded was to be granted a final kindness from a cruel world, an acknowledgement of status and rank, even in death. But that kindness was always a gamble. For the condemned, the moments before the stroke were filled with terror and hope tangled in an impossible knot. Some tried to steel themselves, focusing on prayer or the faces of loved ones in the crowd. Others wept, resigned to the end, but desperate for it to come quickly. There were stories of executioners who showed rare mercy, offering a silent nod or a steady hand that cut cleanly and quickly. And there were tales of those cursed with cruelty or incompetence who turned death into prolonged torment. The axe itself was a symbol of power and final judgment, heavy, balanced, with a razor-sharp edge honed by fire and stone. It was the last instrument of earthly justice. Executioners took immense pride in their tools, knowing that their reputation depended on their ability to deliver swift death. In some regions, they maintained secret schools to teach young men the precise angle and strength required to fell a head in a single blow. Yet even the best could falter. Human error was inevitable, and the consequences devastating. In the broader context of medieval justice, beheading was a spectacle, an event that attracted nobles, townsfolk, and sometimes royalty. Public executions were as much about demonstration of power as punishment. The swift death of a noble was meant to remind everyone of the king's justice, merciful yet absolute. The crowd gathered with anticipation, a mix of horror and morbid fascination. Some whispered prayers, others jeered or cursed the condemned. The atmosphere was thick with tension, a collective breath held as the axeman took his place. For the condemned, the last seconds were a journey through fear, pain, and sometimes a strange peace. To face death was to confront the end of everything known: family, honor, dreams. Some met it with bravery, others with despair. But none escaped the brutal finality of the axeman's mercy. And so, when the blade fell true, there was release. The body slumped, lifeless. The crowd exhaled. The spectacle was over. Yet in the shadows lingered the memory of those whose deaths were prolonged, whose final moments were etched with terror. The axeman's mercy was swift, if lucky, botched, if not, and in those moments, dignity was the rarest prize of all. Then, the crackle of firewood, the hiss of steam rising from bubbling liquid, the sharp tang of scalding water, and there, at the center of it all, a body trembling in terror, moments away from being plunged into a vat of boiling death. To be boiled alive was among the most horrific punishments devised in medieval history, reserved for the worst crimes: poisoners, assassins, traitors. Those whose guilt demanded a punishment so terrible it would send a message to all who dared break the law. Imagine the scene unfolding in a grim courtyard, ringed by wooden scaffolds and roaring flames. The condemned, stripped bare or bound in chains, stands before the boiling cauldron, the thick iron vessel blackened by soot and smoke. Its surface ripples with the furious motion of scalding water, thick with herbs or oils meant to prolong agony. The smell is sharp, like a cauldron of soup left to burn, but worse. It fills the air with a choking steam that blankets the faces of onlookers and executioners alike. The condemned's skin prickles with the heat before the immersion, the air thick and heavy with dread. Their breaths come in short gasps as the executioner forces them forward. There is no mercy here, no last words to be heard clearly over the roar of the fire. Only the crash of bodies hitting liquid and the ensuing scream, an unearthly, gurgling shriek that rises above the crackling flames like a terrible hymn. Once submerged, the human body fights the scalding water like a trapped animal. Muscles convulse, limbs thrash, desperate to escape the boiling embrace. The skin, that protective shield, is the first to betray its owner, turning crimson, blistering, then peeling away under the unrelenting heat. Flesh bubbles and breaks apart, exposing raw muscle beneath. Nerves fire wildly, sending waves of excruciating pain that ripple through the mind and body in tandem. But the horror is not only in the burning. The water, often infused with caustic herbs or animal fats, intensifies the torture, searing through the skin and settling into wounds. The heat causes internal organs to swell and rupture. The lungs fill with steam and liquid, making every breath a struggle between fire and water. Eyes swell shut, tongue curls in agony, and yet the body fights on, sometimes for minutes, sometimes agonizingly longer, until life finally slips away, carried off by the relentless assault of the flames below and the boiling water around. Why such cruelty? In a time when justice was as much about spectacle as punishment, being boiled alive was designed to horrify and deter. It was a public act, meant to shake the bones of every spectator and leave a searing warning etched into the minds of the community. The crime had to be terrible enough. poisoning, in particular, was seen as especially vile. It was a secret, creeping death that undermined trust and order, striking at the very heart of family and society. To kill with poison was to betray not just a person, but the bonds that held civilization together. Assassins and traitors who dared to attack rulers or nobles were similarly condemned to this brutal fate. Their bodies became an example, an agonizing spectacle that marked the boundary between loyalty and betrayal. Justice demanded a punishment that was visible, unforgettable, and deeply feared. Witnesses to such executions described the scene in hushed tones. Some spoke of screams so terrible they pierced the soul. Others recalled the thick clouds of steam rising from the cauldron, blurring the faces of the condemned until they became ghostly, almost inhuman figures twisting in eternal agony. The crowd often fell silent, the spectacle too grotesque even for hardened soldiers and townfolk. Executioners, too, lived with the weight of their task. To force a man or woman into a vat of boiling water was no easy duty. It required cold resolve, a suppression of empathy that could haunt a person for years. Some said that those who carried out the task were themselves sometimes broken by the memory of the flames and the screams. Despite the terror of the punishment, historical records reveal instances where the condemned were given a grim choice, a chance for confession or repentance before the plunge. Such moments, however, were brief and often futile. The boiling was swift and merciless. Confessions, whether real or forced, mattered little in the face of such relentless destruction. In some accounts, the punishment was prolonged by gradual heating. The water would start warm, then grow hotter by degrees, each rise in temperature stretching the suffering. The condemned would know, second by second, the heat creeping closer to unbearable, each moment a fresh wave of pain, a step closer to death. Such slow torture was meant to purify the soul, to extract penance through fire, and to transform the condemned into a cautionary legend. Across Europe, similar punishments appeared with variations. Sometimes boiling oil was used instead of water. Sometimes the condemned were enclosed in barrels of boiling liquid. Sometimes even hot pitch or tar. Yet the principle remained the same: public, visible, unforgettable agony. The aftermath of such executions was equally grim. The remains were often burned or thrown into the river to erase any trace of the traitor's existence. Families of the condemned faced disgrace and suspicion. The horror of the boiling stayed with the community long after the fires cooled. Today, it's difficult to imagine such cruelty tolerated by any society. But in the medieval world, where law was inseparable from spectacle and power demanded visibility, such punishments were grim realities. They remind us that justice was not always about fairness, mercy, or rehabilitation, but about control, fear, and the brutal assertion of authority. Now, the word alone, impalement, strikes a chill. It conjures images of slow, relentless pain and a death stretched out over hours or even days. For centuries in Eastern Europe, especially in the lands of the Ottoman Empire, the Balkans, and parts of the Carpathians, impalement was not just a punishment, it was a nightmare made flesh. The ultimate sentence for enemies, traitors, rebels, and criminals deemed beyond redemption. It was designed to terrify, to destroy, and to serve as a warning, carved into the landscape itself. Impalement was not a quick death. It was deliberate. The victim's body became a ghastly monument to the power of those who wielded the stake. To understand why it was so feared, we have to first imagine the mechanics, the ritual, and the horror of this brutal method. A long wooden stake was prepared, sometimes sharpened to a cruel point like a spear, sometimes rough-hewn and splintering. Its length was sufficient to hold the victim's full height, or more, because the goal was not just to kill, but to display the body in full, pinned as if in grotesque sculpture. The wood was sometimes soaked in resin or tar to prevent decay, ensuring the body remained on display for weeks or even months. The condemned was dragged, often naked, to a public place, sometimes the city gates, a busy crossroads, or a hill overlooking a village. This was no private execution. It was a spectacle. The crowd gathered in fearful silence or ugly fascination, watching the slow unraveling of human dignity and life. The process of impalement began with positioning the stake. It was driven into the ground vertically, leaving a portion exposed. Then came the victim, forced to lie on the ground or held upright, depending on the executioner's cruel method. The stake would be pushed against the body, aiming for a precise point of entry, just below the genitals or the rectum, depending on the variation used. This was no random stab. The goal was to penetrate the body deeply enough to impale the victim through the torso, piercing vital organs slowly and painfully. Imagine the terror, the struggle, the screams. The stake was pushed through flesh, muscle, and bone with excruciating slowness. The victim's weight bore down on the wood as it pierced upward, or downward in some variations, through the body's core. Breathing was a torture in itself, as the stake prevented normal chest movement and pierced the diaphragm or lungs. Pain radiated through every nerve ending as the internal organs were shredded and compressed. Unlike a quick beheading or hanging, impalement offered no mercy. Death could take hours, sometimes days. The victim's cries might gradually fade into moans, then silence. Exposure to sun, wind, and insects compounded the agony. Often, the condemned was left alive long enough to watch passers-by, birds and animals feed on their remains, a slow decomposition that became a warning for others. The psychological terror was as great as the physical torment. To be impaled was to be utterly powerless, vulnerable, and exposed. The mind, trapped in a body pierced and pinned to the world, had no escape from the pain or the humiliation. Death was not just a release. It was a drawn-out sentence of hopelessness. In some cases, the impalement was partial. The stake might pass through the victim's thigh or side, allowing a more prolonged suffering, or the victim was suspended above the ground to slowly suffocate. Sometimes the executioners added a twist of cruelty by covering the victim's mouth or tying the hands to prevent them from pulling themselves off the stake. The infamous Vlad the Impaler, Vlad III of Wallachia, is perhaps the most notorious figure associated with this method. His reign in the 15th century was marked by merciless use of impalement on enemies and criminals alike. He turned the landscape into a forest of stakes, an unyielding statement of fear and control. His enemies, from Ottoman soldiers to disloyal nobles, met their fate impaled and displayed publicly. But impalement was not unique to Vlad's domain. It was a form of capital punishment known across Eastern Europe and the Ottoman Empire, used to demonstrate absolute authority. and instill dread in anyone who might oppose the ruling power. The brutality was a calculated message. Betrayal, treason, and rebellion would be met with a death so cruel that no one would forget it. From a medical perspective, the process defied what we think of as mercy. Modern understanding tells us that death by impalement comes primarily from shock, blood loss, and infection. But before that, the body endures unimaginable trauma. The lungs can collapse, the heart can be pierced, and the digestive tract shredded. Yet because the stake often avoided immediately fatal spots, death was prolonged, amplifying the horror. In art and literature, impalement is rarely described in detail, partly because it is too gruesome, even for medieval chroniclers. But where records exist, they paint a consistent picture of agony, terror, and finality. It was a punishment for the worst of crimes, and a reminder that in the darkest corners of history, justice and cruelty often walked hand in hand. As the victim's life ebbed away on the stake, the crowd would sometimes disperse silently, leaving the impaled body as a ghastly landmark, an unyielding symbol of power and retribution. Days or weeks later, animals and weather would claim the remains, but the fear and the story remained. Impalement is a chapter of human cruelty that stands stark in history, not just for the pain it inflicted, but for what it represented. It was a warning carved into flesh and wood, a terrifying statement about the limits of mercy in a harsh and unforgiving world. Another thing is the Spanish chair, sometimes called the Judas chair, was a grim favorite among medieval torturers. A device designed to inflict prolonged agony while forcing the condemned into a state of unbearable helplessness. Imagine yourself strapped onto a wooden chair, crafted with a cruel intention far beyond mere restraint. Its seat, backrest, and armrests are studded with sharp iron spikes, positioned carefully so that every inch of your body touching the chair is stabbed, poked, and sliced by cold, unyielding metal. The moment you are seated, your flesh is pierced and pierced again, but the real torment has only just begun. You cannot move without intensifying the pain. The spikes prevent you from shifting your weight or adjusting your position to find any sort of relief. Your muscles cramp, your skin tears, and blood seeps through your clothes. Your body instinctively wants to recoil, to pull away, but the leather straps, tightened around your torso, wrists, and ankles, keep you firmly pressed against the cruel chair. Every breath you take echoes your helplessness, each one a sharp reminder of the punishment that is both physical and psychological. But the chair's real horror lies in its heating mechanism. Beneath the chair, the executioner lights a fire, and the wooden frame begins to smolder and burn. Slowly, the heat rises, creeping closer and closer to your bare flesh, intensifying the pain with an almost sadistic precision. At first, it's a dull warmth that quickly becomes unbearable. The spikes, already piercing your body, now grow hot and begin to sear the wounds, turning agony into a living nightmare. Your skin bubbles and chars, where the flames lick the wood, and the smell of burning flesh mingles with smoke and sweat. The pain is relentless and merciless. Time slows as you sit there, trapped in this torment. The minutes stretch into an eternity, and every second drags you deeper into despair. Your cries echo through the chamber, but they bring no mercy, only the cold satisfaction of those who wield the chair. The silence that follows each scream is even more terrifying as you anticipate the next wave of searing pain. Your mind races, desperate for any distraction, but the focus is always on the burning spikes and the slow roasting of your body. The psychological torture is as cruel as the physical. The chair isolates you completely, forcing you to face your suffering alone. The humiliation of being displayed in such a vulnerable state adds a layer of despair. There's nowhere to hide, no escape from the public's gaze. You become a spectacle, a warning to others. Your torment, a lesson carved into your flesh for all to see. Some versions of the chair had adjustable spikes, allowing torturers to increase the pressure on specific body parts, or to reposition the victim for even greater pain. Others featured metal chains or shackles that further restricted movement, ensuring that every breath, every twitch, only drove the spikes deeper into your skin. Occasionally, the chair was placed on platforms in the town square, turning the punishment into a public event, where townsfolk would gather to watch the slow, horrifying demise. The Spanish chair was more than a tool of execution. It was a symbol of control, a reminder of the power wielded by rulers and torturers alike. It was designed not just to end a life, but to break a spirit, to extract confessions, and to terrorize populations into obedience. It was a chair not meant for comfort, but for cruelty. As the flames consumed the wood, the victims' screams would gradually weaken, their bodies succumbing to shock, burns, and blood loss. But long before death, the damage was done. The body broken, the will shattered, the memory etched forever in the minds of witnesses. In the end, the Spanish chair stands as a chilling testament to the extremes of medieval cruelty, a reminder of how punishment was not just about justice, but about spectacle and domination. It is a dark chapter in history where human suffering was refined into an art form, one sharp, burning spike at a time. Then there's buried alive. The very phrase conjures an almost unbearable dread, a slow, suffocating death that combines both physical agony and psychological terror. It is one of the cruelest fates recorded in medieval history, reserved for the most feared criminals, oath breakers, plague carriers, and social outcasts. Unlike the swift justice of a sword or the fiery blaze of a pyre, burial alive was a punishment designed not only to end a life, but to erase a person from the world beneath the soil, forgotten, swallowed, silenced. To understand the horror of this punishment, imagine the moment it began. Your crime, whether it was breaking a solemn oath sworn before God, spreading a deadly plague through careless contact, or simply being a beggar accused of witchcraft, has been judged so grave that death alone is not enough. You are condemned to a fate that twists the natural order of life and death, turning the earth beneath your feet into a tomb and air itself into an enemy. The process began with the accusation and sentencing, often public and designed to humiliate as much as punish. Medieval societies were tightly knit, their rules intertwined with religion and superstition, and breaking those rules invited not just legal repercussions, but spiritual condemnation. For oath breakers, the crime was seen as a rupture of divine trust. For plague spreaders, a threat to the community's survival. And for social outcasts, it was an extension of deep prejudice, turning fear and hatred into lethal finality. On the day of execution, the condemned was led to a prepared grave, often freshly dug outside the village or town boundaries. The soil would still be loose, dark, and cold, the air heavy with a mixture of damp earth and the faint scent of herbs meant to purify or protect. The executioner, an official figure, but one often shunned for his grim work, would escort the victim, sometimes bound or hooded, sometimes forced to walk with a slow, shuffling step, their fate visible to the jeering crowd gathered to witness the final act. Once at the grave, the condemned might be stripped, their clothes removed as a further form of degradation. Sometimes, chains or wooden stakes were used to secure the person at the bottom of the pit, preventing escape or frantic clawing at the walls. In other cases, the victim was left standing or kneeling, depending on local custom, their posture a symbol of submission or penance. The space was tight, barely enough room to move, and the walls were often steep, the soil loose enough to tumble in at the slightest disturbance. Then, the final moment, the slow, methodical shoveling of earth. At first, handfuls of dirt would fall, a cold cascade that might startle the condemned, the first contact of what would soon become their coffin. The sound of soil shifting, settling, and thudding against their body echoed with terrifying finality. Breaths became shallow, panic surged, and the mind raced, trapped in the shrinking space, darkness swallowing the last slivers of light. Suffocation came slowly. Air thinned as the pit filled, the claustrophobic pressure mounting. The sensation of dirt pressing against skin, the muffled thump of earth above, and the creeping chill of burial combined into a sensory nightmare. Medieval accounts describe the terror of those moments as a mixture of physical agony and utter helplessness. Some believed that the soul lingered longer in such deaths, tormented by the unnatural stillness. Burial alive was not merely about death. It was a statement, an erasure. In many medieval cultures, being buried beneath the earth without the rites of the church condemned the soul to restless wandering, a limbo beyond salvation. This made the punishment doubly cruel. Not only was the body imprisoned, but the spirit was denied peace. Certain groups were particularly targeted for this fate. Oath breakers, those who violated sacred promises, were thought to have shattered the very fabric of social trust. Their punishment had to be severe to deter others. Buried alive, they became a warning carved in silence beneath the ground. In some cases, their graves were marked with a stake or simple marker, but often the exact location was forgotten, leaving the victim literally lost to history. Plague spreaders faced a similarly grim fate, especially during outbreaks of the Black Death in the 14th century. Fear and ignorance mingled as communities struggled to survive waves of disease. Those suspected of causing or worsening outbreaks, whether through negligence or alleged malice, were sometimes buried alive to prevent further contamination. Their deaths were both punishment and quarantine, a desperate act in a desperate time. Social outcasts, such as beggars, the mentally ill, or accused witches, sometimes met this fate as well, reflecting the deep fear and suspicion that permeated medieval life. Their existence was often seen as a blight or curse, and burying them alive was a way of ridding the community of their presence. These acts reveal a society where justice was not always just, and where fear often eclipsed mercy. The psychological torment of burial alive has long fascinated historians and writers, Accounts from medieval chronicles and legal documents describe the terror, but the actual lived experience remains difficult to capture fully. What must it have felt like to be engulfed by darkness, the cold soil pressing against your skin, the crushing weight of earth silencing your cries? How did those last moments stretch, turning minutes into eternity? The silence above ground was often profound. No screams heard by the watchers, only the soft, final sound of the earth settling. Sometimes, cruel variations of the punishment existed. Instead of being buried directly in the earth, victims might be placed in hollowed-out tree trunks or wooden coffins, then buried, adding a suffocating wooden barrier between them and the outside world. Or, in rare instances, the condemned were buried only up to the neck, left exposed as a grotesque spectacle of suffering and warning to others. This punishment was not reserved for the lowest classes alone. Nobles and clergy who fell from grace, convicted of treason or heresy, sometimes faced burial alive as an alternative to more public or painful executions. In these cases, it was often meant to strip them of honor entirely, reducing them to forgotten shadows beneath the soil. Despite the horror, there was a strange, somber ritual to the punishment. Priests might be present, offering last rites or prayers to soothe the soul. The crowd, though sometimes hostile, could be silent in the face of death. The grave might be sprinkled with holy water, the condemned's face turned toward sacred ground, a final attempt to reconcile the brutality of the act with the hope of salvation beyond. By the later Middle Ages, burial alive as a legal punishment began to fade, replaced by other methods of execution and imprisonment. Yet its memory persisted in folklore and horror stories, a symbol of the darkest reaches of medieval justice and human cruelty. Meanwhile, there's the Judas cradle. Just the name alone carries an eerie weight, like a cruel joke turned deadly serious. Imagine a device designed not only to punish the body, but to crush the spirit with calculated cruelty. A method where the slow, inevitable force of gravity meets humiliation, and the victim's own weight becomes the executioner's most merciless tool. Picture it now. You are led into a dimly lit chamber, the stone walls damp with the cold breath of centuries. Torches sputter along the walls, casting long, flickering shadows that dance like ghosts on the rough-hewn surfaces. The air is thick with a mixture of smoke, sweat, and the sharp tang of fear. Ahead, an ominous wooden frame looms, a crude but sinister contraption. It looks almost simple, almost laughable, if it weren't for the horror it promises. This is the Judas cradle. At first glance, it resembles a crude pyramid, a pointed, four-sided wooden pyramid, sometimes capped with metal, attached firmly to a sturdy frame. The top is blunt, but deadly sharp enough to pierce flesh. The bottom rests securely, its edges cruelly designed to maximize agony. Its purpose is clear and terrible. Your arms and legs are bound. You are lifted, or more often forced, so that your body weight rests fully upon the tip of this wooden pyramid. The opening, whether vaginal or anal, becomes the point of contact. The pressure builds slowly, unbearably. The flesh is stretched beyond natural limits. The pain is not sudden, but drawn out, slow and merciless. Balance is the executioner's secret weapon here. Unlike swift punishments, beheadings, hangings, or even the sharp bite of the rack, this method stretches time itself. The victim's own weight becomes a weapon against their body. To relieve the pressure is impossible. If you shift, you risk falling. Or worse, the frame holds you firm, the ropes tight, your body a cruel fulcrum balanced against unbearable agony. Now imagine the layers of humiliation added by this method. It wasn't just about the physical torment. The victim was often paraded before crowds, stripped bare, displayed as an example of divine or royal justice. Shame intertwined with pain, every inch of flesh stretched, every muscle tensed under the weight of judgment. The method was meant not only to punish, but to humiliate, to strip away dignity before death or confession. In many recorded cases, the Judas cradle was employed not only as execution, but as torture, a device of interrogation. The hope was that the sheer, unrelenting pain and the threat of slow death would force confessions. Lies might be spoken to escape the agony, or names spilled to save others. Yet, this device was merciless in its logic. Slow, agonizing, inevitable. Unlike many medieval instruments that relied on breaking bones or dismemberment, the Judas cradle attacked the flesh's elasticity, slowly tearing at it, stretching muscles and tissues beyond natural limits. The pain was often accompanied by long periods of unconsciousness, only to be awakened to more torment. In some accounts, victims were left suspended for hours, days, even longer. Their screams, when they came, echoed off the stone walls, a haunting symphony of human suffering. There is a terrifying precision in the cruelty of the Judas cradle. It was not a wild punishment born from impulse, but a deliberate, carefully engineered form of torture. Unlike executions intended to end life quickly, this device turned death into a prolonged event. Sometimes, the victim would die slowly from shock, blood loss, or infection. Sometimes, death came as a mercy after unbearable endurance. The name itself, Judas cradle, carries an extra layer of meaning. Judas Iscariot, the infamous betrayer in Christian tradition, is forever linked to treachery and shame. The device became a symbol for punishing the worst crimes in a medieval society: treason, heresy, or betrayal of the crown or church. The slow public destruction of body and spirit was meant to mirror the betrayal's perceived moral gravity. For the executioner, the Judas cradle was a tool of control. It was a reminder to the people watching that authority was absolute, that crossing certain lines meant suffering that was slow, painful, and humiliating. The victim's screams were meant to silence dissent and terrorize others into obedience. Though the device is most commonly associated with the Spanish Inquisition and other dark chapters of medieval Europe, its precise use and frequency remain debated by historians. Some believe its legend grew larger than reality, stories told and retold as a warning, a nightmare told to children and prisoners alike. Yet the device's existence in trial records and artwork confirms it was real enough to inspire fear. Picture yourself watching such a scene unfold in a medieval town square. The crowd is hushed, a mixture of horror and fascination gripping the onlookers. They stare at the trembling figure suspended over the Judas cradle, knowing their own safety depends on loyalty, obedience, and fear of this very spectacle. The weight of the moment presses down like the device itself, a reminder that in this world, justice was neither kind nor quick. In the end, the Judas cradle is a chilling testament to how cruelty evolved alongside civilization. It stands as a stark reminder that the past was a place where suffering was engineered with cold calculation, where the line between punishment and torture was intentionally blurred. It forces us to look back at history, not with the distance of triumph, but with the quiet acknowledgement of how fragile humanity's progress truly is. Suspended upside down by the ankles, your world shifts abruptly. Gravity pulls relentlessly at your body, blood rushing to your head, veins bulging painfully as the cold air stings your face. The rough rope biting into your ankles is your only anchor to the outside world, dangling you in a cruel inversion where your entire existence feels both helpless and exposed. This is the beginning of the sawing tree, a punishment designed not just to kill, but to terrify and shame, to turn a man's last moments into a spectacle of horror for the watching crowd. Your hands might be bound behind your back or tied to the trunk of a sturdy tree, leaving you utterly powerless. The rough bark scratches your skin, the coarse texture reminding you of your fragile mortality. Below you, the earth seems impossibly far, but inch by inch it will claim you. The air is thick with the scent of damp wood, sweat, and fear. Around you, hushed whispers ripple through the gathering crowd, punctuated by the harsh rasping of the saw being sharpened. The executioner, cold and detached, prepares his tool with practiced precision, a long, jagged saw made to cut flesh and bone alike. The first bite of the saw into your torso is a shock that ripples through every nerve. The blade is cold and merciless as it scrapes through clothing, skin, and muscle. Your inverted position makes it harder to catch your breath. Every breath is a desperate gulp of air, your body convulsing with pain. The saw moves steadily, back and forth, a grinding rhythm that drowns out every other sound, except for your own ragged breathing and the crowd's hushed gasps. Each stroke tears through flesh with sickening resistance, blood beginning to seep, warm and sticky, dripping down your inverted form and splattering the earth beneath. The torment is both physical and psychological. Suspended upside down, your blood pools in your head, causing a dizzying pressure behind your eyes, a pounding in your temples that threatens to overwhelm you. Your heart races, fighting against the tide of pain and terror. Yet you are forced to watch the saw, hear it scrape ever deeper, inching closer to severing your body in two. The world narrows to this moment, the agony, the cold metal teeth of the saw, the inevitable severing that looms just out of reach. The sawyers work with grim efficiency, their hands steady despite the gruesome task. They know the ritual, the spectacle this execution must become. This is not merely death, it is a warning written in blood. For those watching, it is a lesson etched into the very air. Defy the law, betray the ruler, or commit heinous crimes, and this fate awaits. The sawing tree is not about justice, it is about fear, control, submission. As the saw moves downward, cutting through ribs, breaking bones, the pain becomes overwhelming. You might scream, though your breath is scarce, or you might go silent, trapped inside your own mind, retreating into numbness as your body is slowly betrayed. The inversion adds to the horror, not only the agony, but the disorienting helplessness of being turned literally upside down. Blood rushes to your head, making your vision swim, your thoughts fray. Time stretches and contracts, each second a lifetime. Despite the agony, your captors prolong the torment deliberately. There is no mercy here. The executioner's saw grinds relentlessly until your body is nearly severed. Sometimes only a thread of flesh and sinew remains. your torso split between earth and sky. The crowd watches, a mixture of revulsion and morbid fascination, as justice is enacted with a brutal finality. Some onlookers may turn away, unable to bear the sight. Others lean in, eyes wide, with a terrible fascination for human suffering. When death finally comes, it is both release and obliteration. Your body falls from its inverted suspension, limbs flailing briefly before settling into stillness. The sawing tree has spoken, its message soaked into the soil beneath your broken form. The warning is clear. The law is absolute. The consequences swift and merciless. This execution method was favored in various parts of medieval Europe and Asia for its dramatic impact. It combined physical torment with psychological terror, both for the victim and for the witnesses. To be sawed in half was to be literally torn apart by the state's wrath, a punishment reserved for the most heinous crimes, treason, rebellion, or acts that threatened the very fabric of society. By making the punishment public and excruciatingly slow, rulers ensured that fear spread faster than rebellion. Yet, beneath the horror lies a grim practicality. The inverted suspension slowed death by blood loss, making the spectacle last longer. The saw's grinding was terrifyingly effective, designed to inflict maximum pain with minimal risk to the executioners. And the symbolism, hanging upside down, the victim's world reversed, was a final humiliation, a symbolic unmaking of status, dignity, and control. The sawing tree was not just an end, but a performance of power. It revealed the harsh reality of medieval justice, a world where human life could be stretched out, dissected, and displayed in service to order and authority. And it stands today as a chilling reminder of how far cruelty can be engineered when cruelty is a tool of the state. The scavenger's daughter was another no ordinary instrument of torture. It was a cruel Tudor contraption designed not to sever or slice, but to crush, compress, and contort the human body until breath, bone, and spirit strained to breaking. Unlike the blade that sliced clean or the rack that stretched sinew to snap, this device folded its victims inward, unyielding metal, forcing limbs and torso into unnatural, suffocating embrace. It was an invention of cruelty, born from a particular cruelty of mind, the understanding that pain need not come from blood and gore alone. Sometimes, the slow and crushing weight of confinement could be far more merciless. Imagine the cold iron frame, composed of 3 metal bars, 2 horizontal, 1 vertical, hinged together like a steel letter A. The victim's body was trapped inside this frame, forced to bend forward at the waist, knees pulled up sharply, arms folded tightly across the chest. The device would then be closed like a clam, compressing the prisoner into a fetal position. It was a posture no human should be forced to hold for long, let alone with crushing pressure applied from all sides. The scavenger's daughter did not merely confine, it squeezed. The victim's lungs, trapped within the crushing embrace, found little room to expand. Each attempt to breathe became a desperate, ragged struggle. The ribs, forced inward, pinched the fragile membranes of the lungs. The diaphragm strained futilely against the iron bars. Suffocation was not instant, but it crept in steadily, a slow shadow stealing breath, adding panic to torment. The victim's legs, bent unnaturally, began to cramp. The joints, locked tight, screamed with every minute that passed. Circulation was stifled. Limbs went numb as veins and arteries pressed flat under the cold iron. Fingers curled involuntarily, clenched by the unrelenting grip. Muscles, forced into impossible angles, spasmed and burned. The body was a cage for itself, but the pain was not only physical. There was a psychological horror in this compression too. The prisoner, folded like a piece of paper, reduced to a twisted, compressed shell, felt the dark narrowing of the mind along with the narrowing of the body. Claustrophobia set in quickly. There was no escape, no respite. The silence was broken only by the shallow wheeze of breath, the creak of the iron frame, and the muffled cries that the device allowed, only faintly. Eyes could barely open, forced downward, seeing nothing but the steel and shadows. No matter the victim's constitution, the ordeal was torturous. For hours, sometimes days, the scavenger's daughter would hold its prey in agonizing suspension. Unlike other tortures that left clear marks of blood and wound, this one left the body bruised and battered from within. Bones could crack silently under the pressure. Internal organs battered each other as the body curled tighter. Flesh, squeezed between iron and bone, turned purple-blue. The very structure of the prisoner's frame seemed to rebel against the merciless geometry imposed upon it. It was said that the device sometimes led to fainting, a merciful unconsciousness, but the moment of losing awareness was no true release. When consciousness returned, the prisoner found themselves still trapped, still compressed, still gasping for breath. Madness, too, was a common visitor here. Visions blurred and warped through oxygen-starved haze, mind fracturing under relentless confinement. Unlike the rack or the pillory, the scavenger's daughter was compact and mobile, a device easily moved from place to place. This allowed its use in prison cells, dungeons, or even temporary holding rooms within royal courts. Its presence was a chilling threat, a reminder that torment could be delivered without bloodshed, that the body itself could be weaponized by metal and method. The device earned its grim name from its inventor, Sir Leonard Skevington, who crafted it under Henry VIII's reign. Unlike the rack, which stretched the body outward, Skevington's creation inverted the concept of torture. By forcing the body into itself, folding like parchment, the scavenger's daughter was a cruel answer to confession, defiance, and rebellion. Those subjected to it often confessed quickly, eager to escape the suffocating grip, even if only temporarily. Victims were sometimes stripped before placement, their clothes ripped and torn, adding humiliation to agony. Guards would fasten the iron bars with cruel precision, tightening the device slowly, methodically, to maximize the pain without outright killing the prisoner too fast. It was a slow drip of agony, designed to break will and flesh alike. The device was a subtle tormentor. No blood spilled, no dramatic screams echoing down the corridors. Instead, it was the slow, inevitable quiet collapse of the prisoner's body and mind, a squeezing suffocation, a folding of flesh and bone that compressed life itself. Over time, stories spread of the scavenger's daughter's merciless grip. Some whispered it was worse than the rack or the thumbscrew because it tortured the victim from the inside out. Others said it was a fate worse than death, for in that device, death could come slowly, strangled and broken, with the body folded into a silent, crushed shape. And so, the Tudor courts kept the secret of the scavenger's daughter close, its terrifying embrace a tool for obedience, fear, and ultimate control, a reminder that sometimes the most fearsome blade was not a blade at all, but the cold, unyielding squeeze of steel pressing in, folding victims into themselves, forcing flesh and bone to betray their own limits. Then there's the coffin torture, a punishment devised to torment the body and mind through claustrophobic cruelty and utter helplessness. Imagine a cold, cramped metal cage, no larger than a coffin, forged from iron bars so thick and heavy that no human strength could bend them. This wasn't a prison cell where movement was merely restricted. It was a miniature iron tomb designed to slowly extinguish hope. Once condemned, the victim was thrust inside this coffin-like cage, their body forced to curl or hunch in unnatural positions. The cage allowed barely enough space to breathe deeply, let alone move limbs freely. The metal was merciless, biting cold against the skin by night and scorching hot under the midday sun. There was no bedding, only the bare, unyielding metal bars pressing into flesh, making any attempt at rest a torture in itself. The cage was then locked securely, often with a massive iron padlock, and hoisted or chained visibly in a public space, hanging from a gallows, suspended from a tree, or fixed upright in a village square. The purpose was twofold: punishment and public humiliation. Passers-by could see the victim trapped like an insect in a jar, their face contorted with exhaustion, desperation, and suffering. Day by day, the victim would endure the torment of physical confinement, compounded by psychological torture. Hunger gnawed relentlessly as they were given minimal sustenance, usually a few scraps of stale bread or water poured sparingly through the bars. Thirst was a slow-burning agony, compounded by the heat or freezing chill, with no way to shelter from the elements. In the tight confines, muscles cramped and stiffened, circulation faltered, causing limbs to numb or swell painfully. The spine and joints ached from the constant forced posture. The skin chafed and bruised against the unforgiving metal, wounds festering from the friction and lack of movement. Sleep, if it came at all, was broken and shallow, every shift or spasm hitting the metal like a scream of pain. As days passed, the mental torment deepened. The prisoner's world shrank to the narrow space of the cage, a relentless prison of iron and shadows. The inability to lie flat, stretch out, or even stand fully upright crushed the spirit. The isolation was compounded by the knowledge that this suffering was on display for all to see, an agonizing spectacle. The sounds surrounding the cage, murmurs of passers-by, the clatter of market stalls, the occasional jeer or curse, became a twisted soundtrack of shame. Occasionally, some might throw taunts or insults, reminding the prisoner of their condemned status. Others might pity silently, but the victim could never escape the gaze of the world. Many did not survive more than a few days. Death might come from dehydration, starvation, exposure, or the slow shutdown of the body from prolonged immobility and pain. Some cages were left hanging for weeks or even months, the corpses inside becoming ghastly warnings, their faces frozen in the final agony of entrapment. For those who somehow survived, their bodies were forever marked by the ordeal, muscles wasted, bones brittle, nerves damaged. The trauma left an indelible scar on both flesh and psyche. Even if released, the memory of the coffin cage remained a living nightmare, a torturous echo in every breath and movement. The coffin torture was not just about ending life. It was about prolonging death, maximizing suffering in every conceivable way, and stripping away every shred of dignity until only despair remained. It was a grim reminder of the merciless justice meted out in medieval times, where cruelty was a public spectacle and survival a grim contest against iron and time. Thrown to the beasts, an execution method so cruel it borders on theatrical cruelty. A spectacle for the masses, and a punishment unlike any other. Imagine the condemned, stripped bare, shackled or bound in the center of an open arena or a grim city square. The air thick with anticipation, the crowd's murmur growing into a roar as the cages are opened or the leashes are loosened. Here, death is not swift. It is a drawn-out agony, a slow unraveling of flesh and spirit. Wild dogs, often feral packs or specially trained hounds, were among the most commonly used executioners. These dogs, hungry and ferocious, would be unleashed upon the victim. The condemned's first moments were frantic, desperate, scrambling to defend themselves against teeth and claws. But resistance was futile. The dogs, skilled in tearing and mauling, would rip at limbs, tearing through skin and muscle, biting with savage intent. The agony was excruciating and prolonged, the victim howling in pain, bleeding and broken, every breath a struggle against a tidal wave of torment. Death might come only after long minutes or more, dragged out as the dogs worked relentlessly. More terrifying, perhaps, were executions involving trained beasts such as bears. These creatures, huge and powerful, were often caged and starved prior to the execution, ensuring their ferocity would be at its peak. When the cage doors swung open, the bear charged with terrifying force, its massive claws swiping, its jaws snapping with crushing power. The condemned could only try to evade the bear's strikes, but the weight and strength of the animal were overwhelming. The bear would maul, claw, and crush bones with an almost casual brutality, breaking ribs, shattering limbs, and tearing flesh in a carnage that was as savage as it was deliberate. The cries of the condemned echoed, a sound caught between human screams and animalistic howls, echoing through the execution ground. But death by beasts was not just punishment. It was ritual, entertainment, and a display of royal power. Crowds would gather for hours, sometimes days, to watch these events unfold. Royal courts and nobility often attended, seated above the common throng, drinking wine or mead as the suffering unfolded below. The slow, agonizing spectacle reinforced the absolute power of the monarch or ruling elite, demonstrating what fate awaited traitors, criminals, and enemies. The beasts, wild and untamed, were weapons of terror, symbols of nature's fury harnessed to human cruelty. In some cases, the condemned were tied or chained to stakes or poles, unable to flee, forcing them to face the full onslaught of the animals. The positioning was strategic. Arms spread, legs pinned, the victim a helpless target. The animals' attacks were merciless. Every bite and swipe tore into the victim's flesh, leaving ragged wounds, blood spraying, tissue shredded. As the execution wore on, the victim's strength ebbed away, movement slowing, screams turning to groans, and finally, silence. The beasts, still hungry or bored, would continue their assault until the body was barely recognizable, mangled, torn, consumed. Sometimes multiple animals were used, dogs at first, followed by wolves or even lions if available, each step increasing the terror and intensity. Lions, rarer and often brought from distant lands as royal curiosities, were the ultimate terror. Their size, strength, and predatory skill meant they could end lives in moments, but sometimes the executioners used them to prolong suffering, allowing the lion to toy with its prey, pawing and tearing slowly to enhance the gruesome show. The condemned might sometimes be subjected to additional cruelties before the beasts were unleashed. Shackled in iron collars, mutilated, or starved, they were pushed to the brink of endurance so that their final moments were one of utter helplessness and despair. In some cultures, this was also a symbolic cleansing, letting nature's most vicious predators enact justice on those deemed unworthy of mercy or redemption. Execution by animal was, in essence, a public statement of control over life and death, of humanity's domination over the wild, twisted into a display of ultimate terror. It forced the condemned into a violent dance with death itself, a slow, horrifying unraveling witnessed by all. Flesh torn, blood spilled, screams fading into silence. This was punishment made primal, brutal, and unforgettable. The legacy of these executions lingers in history not only as a record of cruelty, but as a chilling reminder of a time when justice was a spectacle and death a slow, savage performance directed by nature's deadliest creatures. The condemned is brought forth, shackled and trembling, eyes wide with a terror that no man can feign. The crowd around the square holds its breath, the usual chatter replaced by an oppressive silence that speaks of collective dread. This is no common punishment, no fleeting torment. It is the ancient, brutal act of skinning alive, a sentence so horrific that even the cruelest judges reserved it only for those who had committed crimes deemed unforgivable by the harshest codes of law and honor. The executioner steps forward, a grim figure clad in stained leather, tools gleaming dully in the harsh sun. His knives, curved and sharp, are instruments not just of death, but of agony prolonged. The victim's arms are tied outstretched to wooden stakes, their body exposed, skin stretched taut and vulnerable. The air itself seems to thicken with the weight of impending horror. With methodical precision, the executioner presses the blade to the skin, just beneath the wrist. The first incision is shallow, almost clinical, but it quickly deepens. No hesitation, no mercy. The cut runs long and slow, the sharp steel parting flesh from flesh. The victim's screams begin faintly, strangled by shock, but soon erupt into a piercing wail that shatters the silence like a thunderclap. The skin, like a fragile membrane, peels away in strips. Muscles and sinew glisten beneath the flayed flesh, raw and exposed. Blood pours freely, hot and sticky, dripping onto the dusty earth, soaking into the straw scattered beneath. The victim's eyes bulge with unthinkable pain, their throat rasping as they gasp for breath. But death will not come swiftly. The process is cruelly deliberate, extending agony, forcing the condemned to endure every moment of their unrelenting torment. Around the square, faces pale. Some look away, unable to bear the sight, while others watch in grim fascination, a reminder of the price for treason, betrayal, or grievous sin. This is a warning writ in flesh and suffering, a spectacle to sear obedience into the hearts of all who witness. As the executioner works, stripping away layer after layer, the condemned's body convulses, muscles spasming uncontrollably. The nerves, exposed and searing, send torrents of agony to the brain, each movement a fresh agony. The scream slow, becoming ragged and hoarse, the voice a harsh rasp on broken air, eyes glass over, clouded with shock and impending unconsciousness, but the body remains tethered to life by sheer will and brutal cruelty. The smell is choking, metallic and raw, mingled with the harsh scent of sweat and earth. The executioner continues unflinchingly, stripping away skin in great flaps, exposing veins and tendons, the vulnerable anatomy beneath, laid bare like a terrible map of mortality. This punishment, though seldom employed, is etched deeply into legend for its sheer horror. It is not merely about ending life. It is about unmaking it, tearing away the protective boundary that defines the self, leaving behind a raw, quivering testament to human fragility and cruelty. When the skin is finally removed, the executioner steps back, the square silent save for the faint, ragged breaths of the condemned, who now lies shattered and exposed, the torment nearing its merciful end. Death, when it comes, is a release that feels both distant and inevitable, a dark salvation from a fate too terrible to endure. This is the legacy of skinning alive, a punishment that transcends cruelty to become a symbol of terror, a brutal reminder that in the darkest depths of justice, mercy is a stranger and suffering an eternal shadow. The condemned stands before you, bound and exposed. A cruel sentence has been passed. Death by archery, but not the swift, merciful kind granted to enemies on the battlefield. This is punishment, a slow unraveling of flesh and spirit. The archers assemble in grim silence, their quivers heavy with sharpened shafts, their bows taut and ready. The crowd presses close, a sea of faces eager to witness justice served in its most harrowing form. The victim's heart pounds. You can feel it in the tense air, not only from fear, but the chilling realization that the executioner's volley might not end swiftly. The cruelest part is the uncertainty. At the signal, arrows rain down like malevolent hail, aimed not to kill outright, but to wound, to break, to prolong agony. The first shafts bite into flesh with sickening thuds. A shoulder, a thigh, the tip's splinter bone beneath ragged skin. The prisoner's breath catches as muscles seize in pain. Blood spurts dark and warm, staining garments and earth alike. But the death does not come quickly. The executioners deliberately aim away from vital organs, a twisted form of torture masquerading as justice. Arrows pierce the prisoner's arms, shattering the bones beneath. A scream escapes, raw, ragged, a sound that silences the crowd briefly, before the murmurs ripple again. With each volley, the victim's body is riddled more thoroughly. Flesh is shredded, veins burst, limbs grow numb and useless. The agony stretches, a cruel parody of survival. To remain conscious, to feel the searing pain coursing through shattered limbs, to gasp for air and wonder if the next arrow might finally bring release. This is the punishment. The executioner's craft is in their control over suffering's length. Not a single arrow flies blindly. Their goal is torment. They aim to disable the prisoner's ability to move or shield themselves, breaking bones so that the victim cannot even writhe away from the next strike. The skin is shredded, the muscles torn. Blood pools beneath, mingling with the dirt. The prisoner's eyes reflect the growing horror, an instinctive, primal plea for mercy from an indifferent world. Yet none comes. The crowd watches, some horrified, some entranced, some hardened by cruelty, to accept this as rightful punishment for grievous sins or crimes. With every new arrow, the victim's strength ebbs, consciousness wavers but never fades. The shock of wounds compounds with exhaustion. Every breath is ragged, shallow. Limbs twitch involuntarily, nerves aflame with torment. Their mind clings desperately to lucidity, fearing the darkness that might mean surrender, yet dreading the prolonged agony if they stay aware. This is execution by archery, a method designed not for honor or battlefield expedience, but to make an example. A brutal spectacle where death is not a swift arrow through the heart, but a slow unraveling of the human form and spirit, piece by piece. Eventually, the prisoner collapses, broken, bleeding, barely breathing. A final arrow, aimed true, pierces the heart, and the torment ends. Silence falls over the crowd. The gruesome lesson is delivered. Justice can be cruel, and punishment more merciless than death itself. You are left with the echo of their screams, the sharp scent of blood in the air, and the indelible image of a body ravaged not just by weapon, but by the terrible will to prolong suffering. Execution by archery, as punishment is a nightmare made real, a slow descent into pain that no man should endure, but many did. This another punishment was as much a sentence for the living as it was for the dead. Those criminals who were hung in chains never saw the solace of a proper burial. Instead, their corpses were left to rot, displayed as warnings to all who dared break the law. Imagine a body suspended high on a gibbet, clanking in the wind, the flesh torn by crows and maggots, the stench a constant reminder of the grim justice administered below. This form of post-mortem torture was reserved for the most reviled: murderers, traitors, highwaymen, and those guilty of crimes so heinous that society demanded a spectacle of deterrence that outlived the offender. Hanging a man in chains wasn't just about death. It was about humiliation, desecration, and a lingering punishment that stretched on for months, even decades. The gibbet itself was a cruel contraption, often a wooden frame towering over roads or village greens where the dead could be seen by many. The body, after execution by hanging, was taken down carefully, or sometimes carelessly depending on the executioner's mood, and shackled in heavy iron chains. These chains bound limbs and torso, preventing the body from collapsing entirely, keeping the limbs rigid in a grotesque parody of life. Sometimes the corpse was nailed or wired to a wooden board before the chains were secured. The ribs visible beneath the skin stretched tight as it dried and decayed. The iron links were thick and rusted, clinking against each other in the wind, announcing the presence of the gibbet from a distance. Exposure to the elements hastened the deterioration. Rain soaked the flesh, then sun baked it dry. Birds feasted on eyes and cheeks, and scavenging animals tore at the limbs. The body swayed like a macabre pendulum, twisting and turning in the breeze. Flesh sloughed off in layers, bones cracked and sometimes snapped under their own weight. Insects laid eggs in the orifices and wounds, their larvae writhing inside what once was human. This spectacle served multiple purposes. To the authorities, it was a demonstration of power, proof that justice reached beyond death. To the public, it was a chilling lesson in consequence. Parents pointed out the gibbet to children as a warning. Travelers crossed themselves and quickened their pace past the stench and sight of rotting flesh. More than punishment, it was a denial of dignity. Burial was a sacred rite, ensuring the dead's passage into the afterlife. Hanging in chains condemned the soul to unrest, a fate believed to haunt the living world, a permanent mark of shame. Priests refused to perform funeral rites, and the condemned were barred from churchyards. Their remains were left to the mercy of nature, a stark contrast to the respectful burials afforded to even the lowest of peasants. In some cases, bodies hung for so long that the wooden gibbets became landmarks. Townsfolk would refer to the gibbet on the hill when giving directions, and the skeletons that remained could last decades before the bones finally crumbled or were taken down. Occasionally, locals would gather relics, bits of chain or bone, treating them as grim souvenirs or tokens of justice. The psychological toll on those who lived near such sites was profound. The smell permeated the air, a constant reminder of mortality and law. Travelers avoided the roads near gibbets at night for fear of ghosts or worse. The image of a decaying figure swinging endlessly in the wind haunted dreams, a symbol of the terrifying reach of medieval justice. Authorities sometimes revisited these sites, replacing the old skeleton with a fresh corpse, a grim recycling of horror that reaffirmed law and order. Over time, some gibbets became so notorious that ballads and stories spread, embedding the punishment deeply into local folklore. This punishment was not just about death. It was about prolonged suffering, an eternal sentence in the public eye, a warning hanging in chains for all eternity. It marked a fate worse than death itself, a desecration that stripped away not only life, but the very memory and respect owed to a human being, leaving behind only a grotesque monument to crime and consequence. Thanks for listening. If you're already asleep, great. We've successfully lulled you to sleep, and if you're still awake, well, that's impressive. If you genuinely enjoy these boring stories about history, feel free to subscribe to our channel whenever you're in the mood. Sleep well, and good night.